This is AP European History, our live stream for today for Thursday, April 9th, I think it is. My name is Todd Beach. I teach AP European History at Eastview High School in Apple Valley, Minnesota. That's a suburb of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this morning, I was just telling Katie before we went on air that during my morning run this morning in Minneapolis, it started out the door and it was sunny. In the middle of my run, it was snowing, and now it's sunny again. So welcome to spring in Minneapolis.
So I'm Katie Lancey. I teach in a suburb of Miami, Florida at Coral Gables Senior High. And it is decidedly not snowing in South Florida now. It is very warm and really in the 80s. Today's actually a really beautiful day. And we're really excited today to start our review with you guys. So I know you've been waiting for it. A lot of teachers have been waiting for it. And so we're happy for that. So today we are going to cover a variety of things. We are, of course, going back to the beginning of the course to start the Renaissance. We'll be contextualizing the Renaissance and discovery and do some of the discovery portion later in our lessons. We'll be talking about the Italian Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, and then some brief information about the advent of printing and the printing press. So today we'll be explaining the context in which the Renaissance and age of discovery developed. We'll be explaining the political, intellectual, and cultural effects of the Italian Renaissance. And we'll be explaining how Renaissance ideas were developed, maintained, and how they changed as the Renaissance spread from Italy into Northern Europe. We will be tackling skill development for developments in processes, contextualization, and making connections. And the historical reasoning development for today is definitely going to be causation.
Great, thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
We left you yesterday with this activity for your homework, and that was to write an introductory paragraph that includes contextualization and a claim or thesis addressing the following prompt. So evaluate whether globalization served as a transformative or destructive force in early 21st century European society. We had lots of responses. Katie and I continue to be so impressed with the work that you're doing. And I was texting her last night. I said, oh my God, you got to read this one. It's so good. So this first response is from Delia from Massabesic High School in Maine. And there are lots of layers to this response, and I kind of color coded that to talk through it. But the uncolored part is definitely the contextualization that Delia, I'm going to pronounce your name incorrectly. I'm really sorry. The first part is going to be this contextualization. So we'll do that as a read aloud. Leading up to the 21st century, there were numerous advances in technology and communication. These all led to more interdependence among nations all over the world. This globalization of trade and industry has impacted every country and region in a unique way. Beginning around 1945, many countries began to decolonize their empires and focus their efforts of improving the economy closer to home. This left many countries that had been under foreign rule for many years independent and figuring out how to manage their government and their economy. And then, so we have pretty good contextualization there. And then we start getting into this green highlighted area that just builds on to what the writer has already given to us. For countries that entered the 21st century in a powerful economic position, globalization served as a transformative force that improved the economy for some, while for countries that entered in a weaker economic position, it served as a destructive force. So definitely address the prompt right there. And it's not necessarily a claim, but they're certainly beginning to position themselves. Then we get to this light blue. It did this by creating a system that separated classes. More developed countries supported more educated professionals and business owners and outsourced the manufacturing labor to the less economically and technologically developed countries. So we definitely have built to that. This led to, in the yellow, to increased wages in these highly developed countries for the elite group of professionals, while increasing poverty and unemployment rates of the middle and lower classes of the countries it was outsourced to. It's really complex, and you would definitely get the point for contextualization, and you're going to get the point for thesis here. The green is really the statement, the thesis statement. It served as a transformative force. It improved the economy for some, while countries that entered a weaker economic position, it served as a destructive force. So you've definitely given us, a statement. One of the things we want to caution everybody on is that when we see the task word evaluate, we're really asking you, we want you to choose a side. So in the green, you've given us two arguments, which is fine. And in the blue, you go into a little bit more detail. In the yellow, you really go into detail. So you're going to get the point for thesis. You're going to get the point for contextualization. And what I would look for in the body of the argument is, are they really going to be arguing for transformative or destructive? And sometimes when students try to just balance and do both, it doesn't work so well. And so when you see that task word evaluate, we really want you to choose a side. And you can acknowledge that the other side exists. It doesn't like you're discrediting that argument either, but we really want you to argue one side and use, especially when you have a DBQ, use the evidence to argue one side. And you're going to get a chance to do that with the DBQ we show you tomorrow. So thanks, Delia, from Massabesic High School in Maine. This is from Gabby at Craig High School in Wisconsin. I think that's in Janesville, Wisconsin. So here we go. Globalization in 21st century Europe has brought economic prosperity through global trade networks. Global alliances have remained, including the United Nations, NATO, and the World Trade Organization. These alliances work towards similar goals of prosperity and international peace. The overall standard of living has risen, and technological advances have improved the global communication network. Globalization has also spurred tensions over human rights, including the death penalty and same-sex marriage, as well as social and economic tensions as ethnic tensions as an influx of refugees are fleeing from their impoverished, war-stricken nations. All that serves as context, and some of it you've given us some details that probably are going to be placed in your argument. But when we think about globalization, or when we think about context, we want to start really broad. What brought us into that? And again, I would say use GeoSprite as kind of a tool to help you begin broadly and then narrow and narrow. You will get the context point here, but we want to make sure that we're saving our evidence. If it was an LEQ, we want to save some of the evidence to be used later as well. So here we go. And you definitely have the claim too in the yellow. 21st century globalization has enhanced society, causing economic growth and global unity, but has also been destructive by creating social tensions, notably over human rights and immigration. So you're acknowledging both sides of the argument. And again, when we give you the task word evaluate, we really want you to choose a side. And then later, if you want, you can acknowledge the other side. And that would be something that you could do to earn the complexity point. Good work there from Gabby in Wisconsin. This is from Susie at Burbank High School in California. So going into the 20th and 21st centuries, technological changes associated with a post-industrial society remade workplaces and lifestyles around the world. Specifically, the low labor costs in neo-industrializing countries, such as those in North Africa and Asia, encourage corporations to outsource labor-intensive manufacturing jobs out of Western Europe and North America to those regions. This new globalization would lead to countries such as China to become economic powerhouses that supplied goods across the world. Really well done for the context. I mean, it's really narrowed it down nicely. And then I circled there in that kind of reddish pink. This is the claim or the thesis that Susie is making. However, this globalization served as a destructive force in early 21st century European society because it led to a new social economic structure with very few insecure positions, forced many into the retail sector by taking away well-paying industrial jobs, and led to new forms of global protest. So I know Katie would really like this thesis, this claim, because we have the word because there. We've taken a position. It's served as a destructive force. And then Susie lays out basically what her reasons and the arguments will be. So that's really well done. And one more, I think. Jennifer from Grassfield High School in Virginia. And I like this response too. There's so many I liked. I kept going back and trying to pick more. And I have to finish. So here we go with context from Jennifer. The 21st century of Europe was characterized by a distinct modernization of everyday life. New forms of architecture were created with Frank Lloyd Wright's functionalism, which introduced a simple, clean, straight-lined approach to building design. Hence, the use of Gothic style and excess decorative elements were now rejected and replaced by function over form. As for the economy, the relationships between nations around the globe were now closer than ever, with outsourcing being a main input of countries' manufacturing industries. With a massive global labor force, low labor costs, were needed to produce powerhouse industries such as those in China that fueled economic growth and exchange of goods around the world. Really nicely done. I liked how you brought in some of the stuff that we had yesterday about the new forms of architecture, and it leads to this idea of businesses, right? And so then you come straight into the economy. So you really started really broadly, but you narrowed it down really quickly, and that's pretty good context. And then in the yellow is our claim or thesis. Although globalization served as a transformative force with the digital age and its benefits, it was also a destructive force in the early 21st century European society because it sparked global protest in response to workers' rights and climate challenges, and it created a wider division between the wealthy and poor, sending many into economic and societal struggle. That, Jennifer, is really, really well done.
It is really well done.
Yeah, I love the because statement and they lay out the reasons. So thank you.
Okay, so we've come all the way back to the Renaissance, and Todd mentioned GeoSprite. So I was a little bit deliberate about contextualizing today using some of those letters. I didn't go through all of them, but I have a really nice mix of them here. I want to point out the visual on the right-hand side as we're talking about change from the medieval time period into the Renaissance. And that is a very typical piece of art from the late Middle Ages after the Black Death has swept through Europe. And this is the dance of death being carried out by these skeletons. And so we see that a lot in late Middle Age art. So let's just go through geographically and economically. Italy is at the center of the Med. It's at the center of the Mediterranean Sea, which makes that an ideal location. It will be central for trade. This will have economic prosperity for many of these Italian city-states, and particularly Florence will be affluent enough to support the Renaissance that will begin in Italy. And then Todd will talk a little bit about how that moves north from Italy. Socially, as I mentioned, we have Western Europe recovering from the Black Plague. It will have killed about 40% of the population. Italy often had wealthy elites, and we would see the blending of the aristocracy with wealthy merchants. The family was definitely patriarchal. We had arranged marriages, and because frequently one spouse would die, we often had remarriages and step parents and blended families socially. Politically, and I know Todd's going to go into a little bit more about this, Italy is a collection of small and large city-states. It doesn't have a real centralized authority. Religiously, life is centered, of course, around the Catholic Church, which is still here. We're going to start to foreshadow some of the decline, but it had withstood the Great Schism in the 14th century. And intellectually, this is, of course, what so much of today's lesson is going to be about. The cities would attract trade, and then ideas and culture would follow this. Artists could imitate classical ideas, which would allow for that rebirth, which is what that word Renaissance means, that some historians, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end, would argue defines this period that we're talking about today.
Thank you, Katie. So let's dive into this, and we begin with wealth and power in Renaissance Italy. And I'm going to present you with this question: how did politics and economics shape the Renaissance? So I think generally, first thing students think about when they think of Renaissance, they do think about Italy and they think about art, and those things are important. But those things don't happen without the political and economic situation that's occurring. And so we have to understand that context as we go forward. So we'll take a look at the map on the right, and this source gives us an idea of what Italy is like. That orange color, we have these different republics, and I'm going to say they're a republic in name, not necessarily functioning necessarily as a republic. There's a duchy in Milan, a duchy of Savoy. There's the Republic of Genoa. Corsica is Genovese at the time. Siena is a republic. Florence is a republic. Lucca is a republic. Modena, Ferrara, and then Venice, as I mentioned. There you see in the purple the Papal States, and then the green, these are Spanish territories. The Kingdom of Naples is actually held by the Spanish King of Aragon. So what we're really trying to get at as the map is it's not united, and that's important to understand, and they're used to this very cultural independence. So in the A paragraph, the Renaissance is a period of commercial, financial, political, and cultural achievement in two phases, from about 150 to 1300, and then from 1300 to 1600. Northern Italian cities led the commercial revival: Venice, Genoa, Milan. Those three cities, because Milan is along the major land trade routes through the Alps. And so coming through the Alps and landing in Milan and then across land to either Genoa or Venice, where those are obviously port cities. And Venice and Genoa are competing port cities for sure. Venice has a huge merchant marine. The merchant marine is important because it protects the trade cargo. So, and they made improvements in shipbuilding, they enhanced trade. These cities become the crossroads between Northern Europe and the East. And so in the D paragraph, the first artistic and literary flowerings of the Renaissance will appear in Florence. Florentine mercantile families dominate European banking, and the wool industry is a major factor in the city's financial expansion and population increase. So the question we can be asking is, why does this happen in Italy, and why specifically Florence? And we have to understand the economics of the situation and the political situation in order to get at those answers. Next slide, please. This is a source. You can see that it's a painting. It hangs in the Galleria d'Accademia in Venice. And so it's the procession in St. Mark's Square. And so you see in the background at the top of the painting, that is St. Mark's. It's a kind of a Byzantine type architecture. And it really kind of represents that mixture of East and West, this Byzantine look, as well as the Romanesque arches. So we have that kind of, I just think it's really a great building to kind of demonstrate the mixture of the two cultures. In the northern Italian cities were communes, associations of free men seeking independence from the local lords. The nobles, attracted by opportunities in the cities, would often settle there and marry members of the mercantile class, forming an urban nobility. So the social aspect of this is that we have nobles coming into the cities. And at this is a time, sometimes some of these nobles are not as wealthy as they had been in the past, but the mercantile class is growing wealthier and wealthier. And so some of these nobles will marry into that class and they form this new urban nobility. We're definitely looking at social hierarchy here. So in C, the popolo, these are known as the common people. They're disenfranchised. In other words, they don't have much say or power in government. They're heavily taxed, and they're excluded from holding any type of political office. So frequently we will see throughout, especially these northern Italian cities, the popolo will rise up and they'll revolt from time to time. And these occasional popolo-led Republican governments often will fail, in part because the local rulers, the signori, they will hire mercenary soldiers to take back. And so these kind of struggles take place a lot. So when we get these different rulers, the signori, which is a despot, a one-man despot, or some of these oligarchies, we see these types of rules under the name of Republican. And then indeed, in the 15th century, courts of the rulers were centers of wealth and art, and that afforded signori and oligarchs the opportunity to display and assert their wealth and power. And that kind of brings us a little bit to the painting. So it's the procession in St. Mark's Square. It's really about kind of showing off courtly art, or court favors, and showing off wealth and extravagance, and making sure that we're seen. And this one is in Venice, obviously. And finally, again, kind of contextualizing wealth and power. As I showed you on that first map, Italy doesn't have any political unity. It's divided into the city-states: Milan, Venice, Florence, Papal States, the Kingdom of Naples in the south. And so because that, it's often open to and susceptible to invasion. So talking just about the political aspects of these areas, Venice is a republican name. An oligarchy, however, of merchant aristocrats run the city, and they elect a doge or duke from among themselves that serves for life. And kind of typical of the time period, especially in Venice, is if they don't like the doge, sometimes the doge would become ill all of a sudden, or maybe they would just outright kill the doge. So doge for life, but with an asterisk with it. And number two, Milan is also called a republic, but in fact, it's ruled by the Sforza family. Likewise, in number three, in Florence, though a republican name, for the most part, it is ruled by the Medici family. Number four, then the Papal States are ruled by the Pope, and the Kingdom of Naples is controlled by the Spanish Kingdom of Aragon. And so other major Italian powers are smaller city-states, such as Siena, Mantua, Ferrara, and Modena. and they compete furiously among themselves for territory. There's lots of stories of Siena and Florence fighting against each other and rivaling each other. And part of that rivaling of each other brings us amazing art and architecture. Then B, the political and economic competition among the city-states prevents, as I mentioned, the centralization of power. And after 1494, a divided Italy becomes a European battleground. And some of the most famous of those are the Habsburg-Valois wars between the German House of Habsburg, the French House of Valois. Italy will not achieve any type of political unification until 1870. It was actually 1860-61 when we have some political unification of Italy. The source I just want to point out is the Battle of Pavia. I love this ancient look, but that's the French king kind of bowing to the Habsburg the ruler at that point. And yeah, the Habsburgs come out the winners in that war. Okay.
All right, Todd. So we have so much that's going on intellectually during this time period. This idea that educated Italians had a conviction that they're living in a new era, but we have to really not have that nod to this deep interest in ancient Greek and ancient Latin literature. So on the right there, you can see, I know we already talked about the Medici family, and there's Lorenzo the Magnificent. And he is going to be a great patron as all of this unfolds. The father of humanism, Petrarch, will advocate delving into the classical past. He believed that he was witnessing a new era where the glory of ancient Rome would be recaptured. And we're going to call the study of this classics humanism. And that word should have been in bold because it's really an important word as we're looking at intellectualism, writing, and art throughout this entire time period. This new era would recapture the glory of ancient Greece and Rome, and we would call these individuals humanists. And this is really the primary intellectual component of the Renaissance. They're going to advocate that human nature and achievements are worthy of contemplation. And we are going to see the downplaying of the importance of the church and an afterlife. And we'll talk about some of the ideologies that spring out of sort of branches of humanism here in a moment. So again, we have the patronage of the Medici family. Humanists are going to begin to explore ideas in ancient Greek philosophy. Reading Plato and other philosophers, will have Neoplatism emerge as an intellectual movement. And man's divinely bestowed nature meant that there were no limits to human potential. That's that word humanism. And so religion will remain important, but will be often viewed as a springboard to greater individual accomplishments. And then humanists also believed in this quality of virtue, the ability to shape one's world to one's will. And there'll be different strands of humanism that'll eventually be reflected in art and through philosophy in the Renaissance. So some of these ideologies, we have an emphasis on secularism. Secularism is a focus on the present and a turning away from concern about the afterlife. And we can see how this is going to foreshadow a bit things that will happen with the Catholic Church going forward. The idea is going to persist that humans can gain rewards in the present, and art would take on an increased emphasis on human beings apart from God in the afterlife. This is not to say that the church is not going to be important during the Renaissance, and that we'll still see the Catholic Church as one of the major patrons of the arts, and we'll get to patronage shortly. But we are starting to see a breakaway of looking at humans as important in the here and now. And individualism in B is a similar concept to this. Individuals in the present are important and worthy of study, and it went beyond this to embrace the idea that human concerns are worthy of attention and consideration. And again, emphasizing that present state of humanity disconnected from an afterlife. Machiavelli, intellectually one of the most famous figures of the Renaissance, writes The Prince. And I know we started off the year in my class reading just some small excerpts from The Prince. We're looking to The Prince as a model for political behavior. We have come to the point where when someone is now called Machiavellian, that is likely not a compliment. He has some famous little buzz phrases that come out of The Prince. I'll point out one: the end justifies the means. So he wrote this for the Medicis, and The Prince is often considered the first modern work of political science. And then there on the right, we have Raphael's portrait of Castiglione. And we'll talk about Raphael, and you know, my kids always, I sort of joke about the Ninja Turtles being named after our Renaissance artists. But Castiglione wrote the Book of the Courtier. And this is a secular model for individual behavior, sort of a how-to manual for a Renaissance man. He writes in the Courtier about how a man needs to be read in the classics, how he should conduct himself in public. And he did have some gender ideas that pushed women out of the realms of math and science, thinking that those were reserved for men. And last, we have Mirandola, who wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man. And this is a classical statement on human potential. And we have in here sort of that Neoplatism, a revival of Plato's philosophy coming out of this time period. So lots of intellectual changes happening, certainly ones that push us away from the church and moving forward. All right.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Our practice today, our guided practice is, I'm using a secondary source. Ross King, probably a lot of your teachers have read Ross King. This particular text is Brunelleschi's Dome, How a Renaissance Genius Reinvented Architecture. We're reading this for two reasons. One, we're going to try and look at this passage about how Ross King kind of creates contextualization for us. This excerpt comes early in the text, and so he's really building for the reader different types of contextualization. And the other reason we're going to read this is to make connections. So we want to understand what's going on in the micro, what's going on in Florence at this time that's going to lead to this explosion of architecture and art that kind of is signature part of the Renaissance. So we'll do this as a read aloud. I invite you to follow along. Ross King's Brunelleschi's Dome. Florence in the early 1400s still retained a rural aspect. Wheat fields, orchards, and vineyards could be found inside its walls, while flocks of sheep were driven bleating through the streets to the market near the baptistry of San Giovanni. But the city also had a population of 50,000, roughly the same size as London's, and the new cathedral was intended to reflect its importance as a larger and powerful mercantile city. Florence had become one of the most prosperous cities in Europe. Much of its wealth came from the wool industry, started by the Humilati monks soon after their arrival in the city in 1239. Bales of English wool, the finest in the world, were brought from monasteries in the Cotswolds to be washed in the river Arno, combed, spun into yarn, woven on wooden looms, then dyed beautiful colors, vermilion made from cinnabar, gathered on the shores of the Red Sea, or a brilliant yellow procured from the crocuses growing in meadows near the hilltop town of San Gimignano. The result was the most expensive and most sought-after cloth in Europe. So if we think about this text, and nice writing by Ross King, by the way, so vivid, but we think about this text in contextualization. So he is telling us that, obviously the wool industry is important, but I'm also seeing in this text a comparison with this city, Florence, with London. I'm also seeing this language about, he's painting what's going on about wheat fields, orchards. I'm learning also in this that we're getting about trade because we're bringing wool from England. We're getting dyes and colors from the Red Sea. So that's kind of the context that Ross King is building. So as you're thinking about building and writing your own context leading into a claim, we're really kind of set the scene for the reader. And Ross King does that really well here. Now, the next thing I want you to do is think about the connections piece that are in this, because he's obviously setting us up for something. He's going to talk in here about a cathedral, the new cathedral. And so if we're building and making these big projects, obviously money is a big part of that. And where is that money coming from? Let's connect the idea of the economic driver and machine that's going on is the wool trade. And because they've got these brilliant colors, it makes it the most sought after cloth in Europe. So that is going to help drive and connect to the art flourishings that we're going to see. Okay, so the economic connection, the micro connection right there is one thing that I want you to be really seeing and thinking about. And it kind of sets us up for what Katie's going to talk about next.
It does. So we're going to get into the art, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because this can be days and days in a classroom if we want it to be. But my first A starts off with exactly where you left off. And I actually really love Brunelleschi's Dome and one of his other works, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, because of his vivid descriptions and sort of the soap opera that Renaissance art often was in the competitions. So during the Renaissance, works were often commissioned by large urban groups, and that's exactly what we're talking about with the Duomo in Florence, the dome on the cathedral floor in Florence. And that was the Florentine cloth merchants, the very, very wealthy cloth merchants, because of how coveted the wool trade was in Florence. So these large urban groups would showcase their power and influence by commissioning works of art. And on the right is a picture of Brunelleschi, and I'll show you his Duomo in just a moment. As the Renaissance moved forward, we start to see wealthy individuals and rulers sponsor art. So we will see merchants and bankers and popes and princes all spend a great deal of money, again, trying to showcase their status. During the Middle Ages, artists were really considered to be tradesmen, and the art was typically unsigned and anonymous. But we are going to see a huge shift during the Renaissance where artists are going to be regarded as creative geniuses, and they'll be sought after for their personal reputations. So we start to see this shift to the artist as celebrity. And then during this time period, we're going to see innovations in art. We're going to see new techniques. We're going to see new mediums in art emerge. Oil paints will be used. The idea of naturalism emerges as painters and sculptors want to emphasize anatomy and show the movement of the human body. And then we're going to have really the use of linear perspective as we are able to see things in a realistic and three-dimensional way. So before I move on to talk about some of those so-called Ninja Turtles, I just wanted to give you a quick look at this photograph that was taken just a couple of years ago of the city of Florence with this just overwhelming dome that Brunelleschi created as sort of the highlight of the church in the center of the city. And if you're ever lucky enough to go to Florence, it takes your breath away as you walk around a corner and see this, and the rest of the city is definitely dwarfed by this incredible dome. And this is exactly what they wanted to do, is to show Florence, because of its wealth and its status, to create something just so incredible and monumental. So I thought it was worth taking a minute and just looking at that incredible picture. So I'm going to go through a couple of the artists from the Renaissance. We have, first of all, Leonardo da Vinci, our quintessential Renaissance man. That term still is used today to talk about someone who is well-rounded and multi-talented. He was certainly well-rounded. He was a painter and a sculptor and a scientist and engineer. He was very interested in human anatomy. He was known for looking at corpses in order to get an idea of what human anatomy was all about. And through this, he produced hundreds of drawings, and we have pages and pages of his notebooks. I wish I had time to show you some of just the interesting things that he planned and created. He did city planning, and he planned hundreds of inventions that would be invented centuries later, things like the helicopter, tank, and machine gun. And so I'm showing you a couple of his sort of quintessential paintings and famous paintings. Obviously, the Mona Lisa, which hangs in the Louvre. We have there painted in 1503, lots of controversy about who the subject of that painting might have been, with her mysterious smile. And then in the bottom, his Last Supper, which he considered an unfinished work. So just a couple of our Leonardo da Vinci works. Michelangelo, similar, there's so many things we could talk about with him. He's also from Florence. He travels to Rome at the beginning of the 16th century, and he's best known probably for his frescoes in the ceiling and on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. Popes wanted to showcase the power of the church, and Julius II, the Pope, commissions him to do these frescoes on the ceiling. The altar wall with the Last Judgment is actually done in the style of mannerism, where artists will use exaggerated muscles, distorted figures, and heightened color to express emotion and drama. And then in the upper right-hand corner, we have his very famous statue of David. And that's just such a perfect look. It is obviously from the story of David and Goliath in the Bible, but it is a very secular look and realistic look at the glorification of the human form and realistic human anatomy as we're looking at David. So a couple from Michelangelo. And then I'm going to stop in Italy today with Raphael. Raphael, another one of our artists. He was the youngest of the great masters, also from Florence. He was commissioned to do work in Rome. And the art in Florence really shifted as we started the 16th century to Rome being the center of the art. He painted hundreds of portraits and devotional images, and he became highly sought after by for his work, also commissioned by Julius II to paint the picture that you see there, which is the School of Athens. And the School of Athens is hanging in the papal apartments, it's in the Vatican, and we have here this amazing secular painting that looks back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome for its architecture, for the individuals that are in the painting. So we have so many things going on here that are indicative of the time. He also honors his contemporaries. He paints himself in the picture. Michelangelo's there in the front, resting on his elbow, and Da Vinci's in the center. So again, I could have shown you many other images. He has numerous images of the Madonna, the mother of Jesus, that he also is quite famous for. And so now we're gonna move north, and I'm just gonna give you a little bit about Northern art, and then Todd will talk to you about the Northern Renaissance. So Northern art tends to be more religious. We often talk about the Northern Renaissance being the Christian Renaissance. We have famous painters that were considered equal of Italian masters. They use different mediums. One of the earliest artists to use oil paints was Van Eyck, which again, I would have loved to have shown you other images. Many of you probably saw these when you went over the Northern Renaissance in your own classes. And then I wanted to point out on the right-hand side this image that we have by Peter Bruegel the Elder. And he's very well known to something that's quite unique about the subject of Northern Renaissance art is this look into everyday life in common places, common people, villages. We see things like peasants and agriculture and customs and traditions that might surround small communities. So this is called the Netherlandish Proverbs, and the painting is filled with proverbs that he's trying to demonstrate in visual form. I like this one because it's still very used today, the beating your head against the wall, a kind of proverb. So again, Northern art has a different feel to it. It tended to be more religious. And then we have these everyday depictions of normal life that was something we didn't really see as subjects in Italy. All right, Todd.
Thank you, Katie. And you're right. I mean, normally in our classes, we spend a good 2 days just examining the art, working through it because it's just so rich. So to try and do that in just a few minutes is really difficult, but you did a nice job. This is about the Renaissance outside of Italy. So these ideas that are taking place in Italy, in the late 15th century, students from Northern Europe will study in Italy, and they'll bring back the new learning to their own countries. And as Katie alluded to, these are Christian humanists that they're thinking about the best elements of classical and Christian cultures and how they should be combined. So part of the Renaissance is this unearthing of ancient scrolls, ancient Greek scrolls, ancient Latin scrolls, this transcribing of what was learned from the ancients. And so what Christian humanists are trying to do is some type of a synthesis, if you will. The classical ideals of calmness, stoic patience, broad-mindedness, and should be joined in human conduct with Christian virtues of love, faith, hope. And so that's kind of this synthesis constructs this idea of Christian humanism. One of the most famous humanists was Sir Thomas More, and his portrait is at right. It shows Sir Thomas More, English humanist, wearing glasses, reading a book from a Flemish school. But Thomas More of England argued that reform of social institutions could reduce or eliminate corruption and war. And he writes in his famous book, Utopia, where he describes a community on an island somewhere beyond Europe where all children receive a good education and adults divide their day by work and intellectual activities. Another famous Christian humanist is the Dutchman Erasmus. He's an expert in Bible and Greek language, and then believes that all Christians should read the Bible for themselves. So Erasmus has a long list of publications that includes The Education of a Christian Prince, and probably the one that is used and talked about more often is In the Praise of Folly. And two fundamental themes run through all of Erasmus's work. Education is the means to reform, and Christianity is an inner attitude of the heart and spirit. So both these humanists talk about education being such an aspect and so important to reform. And then, there is humanism in your studies and your scholarly studies, and generally humanist ideas are expressed through English language classes and through social studies classes. Next slide, please. One thing we want to talk about too is the printed word at this time. This is topic 1.4 actually in the curriculum guide. So about 1455 in the German city of Mainz, Johann Gutenberg, who is a metalsmith, and two other men invent movable type printing press. It's similar to the woodblock printing techniques that had originated in China and Korea centuries earlier. And speaking of China and the Near East, paper production had reached Europe in the 12th century from those lands. But printing, this idea of metal movable type, means we can start to mass produce material. And printing then makes government and church information and propaganda much more practical, and it creates an invisible public of readers. It increases literacy amongst lay people. Because before, if we wanted to print something, chances are, first of all, it would have to be handwritten, and most of the time it would be in Latin, because the people who were producing most of that work were monks. But now we can make printing and make these things available for common people, and we can do it at a mass project, and we can put out information rather quickly. So it is estimated that within 50 years of the publication of Gutenberg's Bible in 1456, somewhere between 8 million and 20 million books were printed. I know that's quite a spread, but the number is far greater than the number of books produced in all of Western history up to that point. And I bring you D because I want to demonstrate to you how much this made an impact on Western society. And then just a modern idea, take a look at Source It Right. This is just from this past November in Hamburg. An employee at an auction house will show different pages of a volume of a Gutenberg Bible, which is auctioned off in an anniversary, auction of valuable books. And it was printed in 1462. And that thing will sell at an estimated price about 1 million euro. So hold on to your old books, I guess. That may be what that means. And then in E, the other thing that happens because of the printing press is printers create professional reference book for lawyers, doctors, students, historical romances, biographies, how-to manuals for the general public. And so we start to see literacy amongst lay people really increase and explode. And then we see sharing of ideas. And then we see also people being more critical of things that are put in front of them instead of just taking things that are in front of them as fact. And that's also a really important period of this time.
And we're going to see that, of course, also foreshadow where we're going with some of these reviews moving forward with the Reformation. So very quickly, social hierarchies that are existing during the Renaissance. Renaissance Italy is built on divisions that exist in the Middle Ages. We do have divided nobles and common people, but we also have new concepts that would divide race, class, and gender. Beginning in the 15th century, there is slavery, particularly on the Iberian Peninsula and in Italy. We're going to have Portuguese sailors bringing African slaves to markets. They're not the very first time they've been here, but it does become much more widespread. We have a hierarchy that's based on wealth that emerges. And as we've already kind of mentioned this, we have this mixing of titled nobility, but also these really wealthy merchants that can purchase titles and also marry their children into blended families. So we're going to see the children of wealthy merchants marry into noble families a great deal. And then we're also going to see at the end this question about the debate about women. Where do women belong in society? And the two images that I have here are Christine de Pizan and Isabella d'Este, and her portrait there is by Da Vinci. There's numerous portraits of her, but I thought the Da Vinci one was kind of showing her prominence. And she's particularly a huge patroness of the arts, someone that was labeled the first lady of the Renaissance, so to speak. And these women are really intellectualizing their own roles, and particularly critical of being confined to the domestic sphere, that idea that women belong in the home. There were certainly some men that championed women being educated, but for the most part, what we see is an education that cannot be equal to men, and the kind of education men could receive was off limits to women. So there's kind of a question, did women have a Renaissance? And the answer at this point is probably no. All right.
Thank you, Katie. Okay, so today we covered a lot of ground. We went through 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, talk about the context in which Renaissance age of discovery developed, the political, intellectual, cultural effects of Italian Renaissance, talk about how Renaissance ideas are developed and maintained and how they spread to Northern Europe. We also talked about printing, developments and processes, contextualization, making connections, causation, all of those skill development pieces were there. And now for your homework.
Nice. So I'm going to really quickly just, by the way, yes, let me remind you again that tomorrow we're going to have a modified 5-document DBQ so that you can practice and time yourself and then send in. And then on Monday, we will showcase the different parts of that DBQ and how you did a good job on providing evidence and sourcing. We really look forward to that. So I'm going to go kind of with what you did for your homework yesterday, because I think this is definitely worth practicing. And I know you're going to have 5 documents and sourcing to do over the weekend. So if you take a look at the prompt, evaluate the extent to which the Renaissance transformed European culture in the 15th and 16th centuries. This is where we're looking for you again to do a paragraph of contextualization with a claim and thesis, making sure that your claim and thesis has a line of reasoning. That word evaluate is asking for how, why, an explanation that goes beyond a list. So we just talked a lot about what's going on during the Renaissance. It's important, you probably learned at the beginning of the year that word Renaissance is a construction that happened after the time period. And as we've talked about throughout all of these lessons, when we've talked about secondary sources, historians don't always agree on whether or not the Renaissance should be such a monumentous deal that it is. Some historians argue that the limited scope geographically and economically that the Renaissance had, really only the very wealthy benefited from all of this culture in the Renaissance. So I want you to take your stance on evaluating the extent to which it transformed culture and give us some nice contextualization and a nice claim. And as always, if you email those responses to apeuro@gmail.com, we've had some great examples. And this is all skills that you're going to have to do on that DBQ, so it's worth practicing.
Just a quick message from College Board. We know that not all students have access to the internet or a device. We're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, reach out to College Board directly at cb.org/tech. Okay.
All right.
There you go. The Renaissance in 45 minutes. That's pretty impressive.
Anyway, everybody have a great day, and we're looking forward to going over the DBQ and giving you some structure and everything for that tomorrow. So take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.